The fluorescent lights of Mount Sinai Hospital cast harsh shadows as Charles Woodward's expensive leather shoes echoed through the sterile corridors. His usually impeccable suit was disheveled, his tie loosened a far cry from the composed billionaire who commanded Wall Street's attention daily. Mr. Woodward, Dr. Emily Richardson's voice cut through the chaos. "She's in here." Through the window of the intensive care unit, he saw Antoinette lying motionless, her pregnant belly pronounced under the hospital sheets. Machines beeped rhythmically around her, their sounds a cruel reminder of how quickly life could unravel. Just hours ago, she had been playing the grand piano in his mansion, her fingers dancing across the keys, her smile radiant as she felt the triplets kick. "The preeclampsia is severe," Dr. Richardson explained, her voice steady but grave. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high. We need to make a decision, and we need to make it now." Charles's hands gripped the window ledge, his knuckles white. "What kind of decision?" "The stress on her heart is critical. We can either perform an emergency C-section to save the babies, but the strain might be too much for her in this condition." Dr. Richardson paused, the weight of her next words hanging heavy in the air. "Or we try to stabilize her first, but that puts the triplets at risk." Through the glass, Charles watched as Antoinette's eyes fluttered open. Despite her condition, she reached for her belly protectively. Even now, facing death, her first thought was for their children. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment all the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble. "She's asking for you," a nurse said softly. Inside the room, Antoinette's usually melodious French accent was barely a whisper. Charles, her hand found his, squeezing with what little strength she had left. "Promise me, save them. No matter what happens to me." "Don't," he commanded, his voice breaking. "Don't you dare make me choose." But as the monitors began their frantic beeping and medical staff rushed in, Charles Woodward, the man who had built an empire by making calculated decisions, faced the most impossible choice of his life. For the first time since his childhood, he felt hot tears rolling down his cheeks as he watched the woman who had changed his world slipping away, along with the 3 tiny lives they had created together. Charles Woodward stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Upper East Side penthouse, Manhattan's glittering skyline stretching before him like a sea of stars. At 45, he had amassed more wealth than most could dream of, yet the reflection staring back at him from the glass told a different story, one of a man haunted by his past. 20 years ago, he had been nothing more than an ambitious trader with a dream. Through ruthless determination and an uncanny ability to predict market trends, he had built Woodward Capital from the ground up. Now his name adorned buildings, his face graced magazine covers, and his word could move markets. But success had come at a price he hadn't anticipated. His first marriage to Rebecca Thompson had been what many would call a society match. She was from old money, he was the rising star, and their union seemed perfect on paper. For 3 years they played the part of Manhattan's golden couple, attending galas and charity events, their pictures splashed across page 6, but behind closed doors the cracks began to show. Rebecca couldn't understand his drive, his need to build something of his own. "Why can't you just be content with what we have?" she would ask, not understanding that for Charles it was never about the money, it was about proving himself. The divorce was quiet, civilized, as befitting their social status. Rebecca took her share and disappeared to Europe, leaving Charles with his first lesson about love. It was temporary, conditional, and ultimately disappointing. But it was his second marriage that truly hardened his heart. Sarah Mitchell had been different, or so he thought. A brilliant investment banker herself, she understood his world, matched his ambition. Their courtship was a whirlwind of shared dreams and passionate declarations. When they married, Charles believed he had finally found his equal, someone who saw him for who he was rather than what he owned. The betrayal, when it came, was devastating. Sarah had been systematically stealing corporate secrets, selling them to competitors, all while building a case for divorce that would give her control of half his empire. The night he discovered her treachery remained seared in his memory, finding the encrypted emails, the offshore accounts, the carefully documented evidence she had been gathering against him. "Did you ever love me?" he had asked her that night, his voice hollow. Her laugh still echoed in his nightmares. "Love? Oh, Charles. Love is for people who can't see the bigger picture. You taught me that." The legal battle that followed was brutal. Sarah had been thorough, patient, and calculating. She had cultivated relationships with board members, planted stories in the press, and positioned herself as the wronged party. For months, Charles fought not just for his company but for his reputation. The media feasted on every detail: the self-made billionaire versus the scheming wife. In the end, he retained control of Woodward Capital, but the cost was more than financial. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. Love became a weakness he refused to indulge. He threw himself into work with renewed vigor, expanding his empire across continents. His name became synonymous with success, but those who worked closely with him noticed the change. The warm smile that had once charmed investors was replaced by a cold efficiency. Board meetings that had once been collaborative became exercises in absolute control. His family watched with growing concern as he built walls around himself, each brick mortared with disappointment and disillusionment. His sister Elizabeth tried to set him up with suitable women, but Charles saw through their practiced smiles and calculated interests. To him, they were all potential Sarah Mitchells, waiting for their moment to strike. The years passed, and success continued to pile up like dust on his shelves of awards and accolades. His penthouse grew more elaborate but emptier. The art on his walls, chosen for investment value rather than beauty, stared down at him like distant judges. Even his closest advisors knew better than to mention anything personal during their meetings. But lately, something had been shifting inside him. Walking through his marble halls at night, he would catch himself thinking about legacy. What would remain of Charles Woodward when the markets closed for the final time? His name on buildings? His portfolio in the history books? There had to be more. The idea of a child and heir began to take root in his mind. Not a wife, not love, but continuation. Something practical, controllable, defined by clear terms and conditions. A contract, not a commitment. It was the perfect solution, all the benefits of legacy without the messiness of emotion. Looking out over his domain that night, Charles Woodward made his decision. He would find a suitable arrangement, create an heir, and ensure his empire had a future. Everything would be carefully planned, legally binding, and absolutely devoid of emotional complications. How wrong he would prove to be. 6 years before her fateful encounter with Charles Woodward, Antoinette Voller had been the rising star of the Paris Conservatory. Her delicate fingers could make Chopin weep and Liszt dance, earning her the nickname L'Ame de Paris, the soul of Paris. At 22, she had the world at her feet, with concert halls across Europe clamoring for her performances. Born into a modest family in Provence, Antoinette's gift was discovered early. Her parents, though far from wealthy, sacrificed everything to nurture her talent. Her father worked double shifts at the local vineyard, while her mother took in extra sewing, all to pay for her lessons. The old upright piano in their tiny apartment became her sanctuary, her escape, her dream machine. Music isn't just in your fingers, ma chérie, her mother would say, it's in your heart. Never let anyone steal that from you. Those words would haunt her in the years to come. Her breakthrough came at 19, when she won the prestigious international Chopin competition in Warsaw. Suddenly, the poor girl from Provence was thrust into a world of crystal chandeliers and champagne receptions. It was at one of these events that she met James Cooper, a charismatic American investment banker who seemed to appreciate both her music and her soul. James was everything her simple upbringing wasn't: sophisticated, worldly, ambitious. When he spoke of America, of New York's endless possibilities, Antoinette found herself dreaming of a life beyond the concert halls of Europe. His proposal came after a whirlwind romance, accompanied by promises of a music school in Manhattan where she could teach while pursuing her career. "Together we'll build something beautiful," he had promised, slipping a diamond ring on her finger that seemed to weigh as much as her dreams. She sold everything: her small apartment in Paris, her beloved Steinway, even her mother's antique jewelry. James convinced her to invest it all in their shared future, in the school they would build together. Her parents worried, but Antoinette was blinded by love and ambition. The truth revealed itself piece by piece after they reached New York. First, there were delays with the school's paperwork. Then, mysterious problems with their joint accounts. The final blow came one morning when she woke to find James gone along with every cent she owned. Even her passport had vanished, leaving her stranded in a foreign city with nothing but the clothes in her closet and a worthless engagement ring. The police were sympathetic but helpless. James Cooper, they discovered, wasn't even his real name. He had done this before, targeting talented artists and musicians with promises of love and success. Antoinette was just his latest victim. Pride kept her from calling home. How could she admit to her parents that their sacrifices had ended in such foolishness? Instead, she took whatever work she could find: waitressing, cleaning houses, teaching basic piano to children. But New York was merciless, and each month she slipped further behind. The descent into homelessness wasn't sudden but gradual, like a slow, sad nocturne. First, she moved to a smaller apartment, then a shared room, then a shared room, then a shelter. Her once graceful hands, which had drawn tears from audiences across Europe, became rough from cleaning jobs and dishwashing. The music within her grew quieter, drowned out by the harsh symphony of survival. Yet even in her darkest moments, Antoinette refused to let go of her dignity. She kept herself as clean as possible, maintained perfect posture, and never begged. Instead, she would find quiet corners in public buildings with pianos playing for spare change when allowed. Those who stopped to listen often remarked on the haunting beauty of her music, not knowing they were hearing the last notes of a dying dream. The streets of New York became her new concert hall, though her audience now consisted of pigeons and hurried pedestrians. She learned which churches offered the warmest refuge, which cafes might spare day-old bread, which doorways provided the safest shelter. Through it all, she held on to her mother's words about music being in her heart, even when her frozen fingers could barely move. Some nights she would sneak into hotel lobbies just to be near a piano, her fingers hovering over the keys she dared not play, remembering the standing ovations, the flowers, the life that now seemed like someone else's memory. The security guards, when they caught her, were usually kind enough to let her warm up for a few minutes before sending her back into the cold. It was during one of these nights, as she huddled in a doorway near Central Park, that fate decided to play an unexpected chord in the symphony of her life. A black Lamborghini stopped at a red light, and behind the wheel sat Charles Woodward, a man whose own heart had forgotten its music. The lives orbiting Charles Woodward and Antoinette's story were far from simple background characters. Each carried their own complex motivations and hidden depths that would profoundly impact the unfolding drama. Tom Francis, at 38, was more than just Woodward Capital's chief legal counsel. Behind his polished Harvard law degree and impeccable suits lay a man who had clawed his way up from working-class Boston through sheer determination. For 12 years, he had been Charles's right hand, the architect of his most complex deals, and the keeper of his darkest corporate secrets. Yet beneath his loyal exterior churned ambitions of his own. In his glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan, Tom kept a small photo hidden in his desk drawer, a reminder of his own past losses. His sister, lost to the streets of Boston 20 years ago, shared the same haunting blue eyes as Antoinette. Perhaps that's why her arrival stirred something deep within him, awakening both protective instincts and desires he thought long buried. Mr. Francis, his secretary, would say, "Miss Voller is here for the contract review." Each meeting became a quiet torment. Watching her transform from a street angel to an elegant presence in Charles's mansion fed a growing obsession. Was he falling in love, or was she just a ghost of his lost sister? Even Tom wasn't sure anymore. Stephanie Parker, the head housekeeper, came with her own story. At 55, she had served in the Woodward mansion for 20 years, watching Charles's descent into emotional isolation with maternal concern. She was there through both divorces, silently cleaning up the broken glasses and torn photographs, wondering if her employer would ever find true happiness. Grey-haired but straight-backed, Stephanie ran the household with quiet efficiency. Her domain was a world of starched linens and polished silver, where every detail reflected the perfection Charles demanded. Yet beneath her professional exterior beat a heart of gold that recognized Antoinette's worth from day one. "The house feels different with her here," Stephanie confided to her staff. "It's as if the rooms themselves are waking up." Dr. Emily Richardson earned her position as head of obstetrics at Mount Sinai through years of dedication. At 42, she had delivered thousands of babies, but something about the Woodward case touched her differently. Perhaps it was the way Charles's mask slipped whenever Antoinette's health was discussed, or how the young woman's courage reminded her of her own struggles as a young doctor. "Medicine can measure heartbeats," she would say during their consultations, "but some forces of life remain beyond our instruments." But it was Sarah Mitchell, Charles's second ex-wife, who posed the greatest threat. Still stunning at 40, she had parlayed her divorce settlement into her own investment firm, but success hadn't satisfied her appetite for revenge. From her office in the competing glass tower, she watched Charles's life through hired eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "He thinks he's finally found happiness," she would muse to her conspirators. "Let's see how well he protects it this time." The supporting cast extended beyond these key players. There was Marcus Chen, Charles's head of security, whose keen eyes noticed everything but whose loyalty remained untested. Elizabeth Woodward Hayes, Charles's younger sister, who desperately wanted her brother to find love again but feared his choices, and Father Michael at St. Patrick's Cathedral, who offered Antoinette shelter during her darkest days and now watched her rise with quiet pride. Each of these individuals would play crucial roles in the months to come, their actions rippling through the lives of Charles and Antoinette in ways none could predict. Some would prove to be guardian angels, others wolves in sheep's clothing. Their intersecting paths would create a web of loyalty, betrayal, redemption, and sacrifice that would test the very foundations of love and trust. As autumn turned to winter in New York City, these players took their positions in a drama that would transform them all. In the marbled halls of Woodward Capitol, the sterile corridors of Mount Sinai Hospital, and the whispered conversations of Upper East Side drawing rooms, the stage was being set for a story that would shake Manhattan society to its core. Little did they know that their carefully constructed worlds were about to collide in ways that would leave no one unchanged. As Stephanie often said while watching the city lights from the mansion's windows in New York, even the most carefully written stories sometimes find their own endings. The December wind whipped through Central Park as Charles Woodward's Lamborghini Diablo idled at a red light. Through the tinted windows, Manhattan's holiday lights twinkled like distant stars, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the contract sitting in his briefcase, a document that would change lives forever. That's when he saw her. Antoinette stood on the corner, her thin coat barely protection against the bitter cold. Even in her shabby clothes, there was an undeniable grace to her posture, a dignity that caught his eye. When she approached his window, their gazes met briefly, her haunting blue eyes against his steely grey ones. Spare some change, her French accent surprised him, cultured despite her circumstances. Something about her voice, her bearing, made him pause. Instead of his usual dismissal, he found himself saying, "Get in!" The interior of the car fell silent as Antoinette hesitated, years of street wisdom warring with desperation. Finally, she slipped into the leather passenger seat, bringing with her the cold of the New York winter and a presence that somehow made the spacious car feel smaller. "I have a proposition for you," Charles said, his voice maintaining its businesslike tone, one that could solve both our problems. The drive to his Upper East Side mansion was tense with unspoken questions. In his wood-paneled study, under the watchful eyes of ancient law books, Charles laid out his terms with clinical precision. Tom Francis, summoned at this late hour, took notes with professional detachment. "The arrangement is simple," Charles explained, pacing before his desk. "You will carry my child through artificial means. In return, you'll receive $5 million upon delivery, plus all medical care and living expenses during the pregnancy. After the birth, you agree to disappear, preferably back to France." Antoinette sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll find someone else. But you won't find another offer like this." Tom watched the exchange with growing unease. There was something about the way Antoinette held herself, an innate refinement that seemed at odds with her current state. Perhaps he interjected, "Miss Voller would like time to consider." "No," Antoinette said quietly. "I don't need time. I accept." The contract itself was 40 pages of legal precision. Tom had spent weeks crafting it, anticipating every possibility. Custody rights, medical decisions, confidentiality clauses, each point designed to protect Charles's interests while ensuring Antoinette could never claim more than her agreed compensation. As Antoinette read through the documents, her fingers traced the words with an elegance that caught both men's attention. These were not the rough hands of someone who had always lived on the streets. "You play piano," Charles observed, surprising himself with the comment. Antoinette's hand stilled. "I used to, in another life." The signing ceremony was brief but heavy with significance. Each signature represented different dreams: Charles's for legacy, Antoinette's for survival, and Tom's growing desire to protect her from what he saw as a coldly calculated arrangement. Initial here, and here Tom guided her through the pages. "This section covers the confidentiality agreement. This one deals with medical procedures." With each stroke of the pen, Antoinette felt pieces of herself being signed away. Yet there was something else, something none of them could have predicted. As Charles watched her sign, a strange sensation tugged at his carefully guarded heart. Her graceful movements, the quiet dignity with which she accepted each term, stirred memories of music he'd long forgotten. "One last thing," Charles said as the final page was signed. "From this moment on, you'll be living here, under my roof. Stephanie will show you to your quarters." As if on cue, the housekeeper appeared, her kind face masking any judgment about the unusual arrangement. "This way, Miss Voller." Later that night, as Charles sat alone in his study, the signed contract before him, he heard something unexpected: the faint sound of piano keys from the rarely used music room. The notes were hesitant at first, then grew more confident. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the mansion with a melancholy beauty he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He found himself walking toward the music, drawn by an invisible force. Through the doorway he saw Antoinette at his grand piano, her eyes closed, her body swaying gently with the music. For a moment she wasn't a contractor or a surrogate, she was pure artistry, pure soul. Then she sensed his presence and stopped abruptly, her hands falling to her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." "No," Charles said, surprising himself again. "Please continue." But the spell was broken. Antoinette rose from the piano bench, gave a small nod, and followed Stephanie to her room, leaving Charles alone with the lingering notes and the unsettling feeling that this contract might be more complicated than he'd planned. The morning after the contract signing, Stephanie Parker stood in Antoinette's new suite, surveying the task before her. The young woman slept soundly in the massive four-poster bed, exhaustion evident even in repose. Sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated years of hardship etched on her face, but couldn't disguise an underlying grace that catching Stephanie's experienced eye. "First things first," Stephanie muttered, opening the heavy drapes fully. "We'll need to make you look the part." Antoinette stirred, momentarily disoriented by the luxurious surroundings. "What time is it?" "Time for your new life to begin," Stephanie replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Mr. Woodward has arranged everything. The stylist will be here in an hour, followed by the personal shopper, dentist and doctor." What followed was a carefully orchestrated transformation that would have impressed Broadway's finest costume departments. Maria Torres, Manhattan's most discreet stylist, worked her magic on Antoinette's neglected hair, revealing natural honey gold waves that softened her features. Dr. Klein, the family dentist, restored her smile to its former brilliance. Each professional worked with quiet efficiency, asking no questions about the mysterious young woman in Charles Woodward's mansion. The personal shopper, Jessica, arrived with racks of designer clothing. Mr. Woodward was specific, she explained, unveiling elegant pieces from Chanel, Dior, and other prestigious houses. The wardrobe should reflect sophistication and refinement. Antoinette touched the fine fabrics with trembling fingers. "This is too much." "This is necessary," Stephanie corrected gently. "In Mr. Woodward's world, appearance isn't vanity, it's armor." As the day progressed, the physical transformation was striking, but it was the subtle changes that truly captured the household's attention. The way Antoinette naturally gravitated toward the piano in quiet moments, her perfect posture even in casual settings, her impeccable table manners all spoke of a refined past at odds with her recent circumstances. The staff, initially wary of this unusual arrangement, found themselves drawn to her genuine warmth. Marcus Chen, the normally stoic head of security, actually smiled when she thanked him in perfect Mandarin, a remnant of her conservatory days. The kitchen staff beamed when she complimented their cooking in fluent Italian. "She's not what we expected," whispered Alice, one of the maids, to Stephanie. "There's something special about her." The transformation reached its culmination that evening when Charles returned from the office. He stepped into the mansion's grand foyer just as Antoinette descended the main staircase. The sight stopped him mid-stride. Gone was the street-worn woman from the previous night. In her place stood someone who looked born to grace these halls. A simple black dress highlighted her elegant frame, while her newly styled hair framed features that now radiated health and vitality. But it was her bearing that truly commanded attention, the perfect blend of grace and quiet confidence. Charles found himself staring, his customary composure slipping. "You look appropriate," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. Antoinette met his gaze steadily. "Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Woodward." "Charles," he corrected automatically, then seemed surprised by his own words. Their first dinner together that evening was a study in unspoken tensions. Charles watched with growing fascination as Antoinette navigated the formal place setting with unconscious ease, selected wines with knowledge that spoke of cultural refinement, and carried herself with a natural elegance that no stylist could have created. Tom Francis, joining them for dinner to discuss medical arrangements, found himself increasingly distracted by the mystery she presented. "You mentioned playing piano," he probed gently. "Where did you study?" A shadow crossed Antoinette's face. "Paris Conservatory," she answered softly. "But that was another life." The revelation hung in the air, raising more questions than it answered. Charles's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his wine glass, his mind racing with implications. A concert pianist reduced to homelessness. There was clearly more to her story than she was revealing. Later that night, after everyone had retired, Stephanie found Antoinette in the music room again, her fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. "You don't have to hide who you are," Stephanie said quietly. Antoinette turned, tears glistening in her eyes. "Who I was died in the streets of New York." This she gestured to her transformed appearance. "This is just another role to play." But Stephanie, wise from years of observing human nature, knew better. "No, dear, this isn't a role, it's a renaissance. The question is, are you ready for what that might mean?" As if in answer, the opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the room, each note carrying the weight of a story yet to be told. The first signs of trouble appeared 3 weeks after Antoinette's arrival at the Woodward mansion. The New York Post's page 6 ran a speculative piece titled "Mystery Woman in Billionaire's Lair," complete with grainy photos of Antoinette entering the mansion. The article painted lurid possibilities about her identity and relationship with Charles, setting Manhattan social circles abuzz with gossip. Sarah Mitchell, Charles's second ex-wife, sat in her penthouse office at Mitchell Financial, scanning the article with growing interest. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped rhythmically on her desk as she reached for her phone. "Get me everything you can find on this woman," she instructed her private investigator. "I want to know where she came from and what she's really doing in my old house." Meanwhile, at Woodward Capital, Tom Francis found himself increasingly distracted. Each legal meeting with Antoinette became an exercise in professional restraint. Her quiet intelligence, the way she asked precise questions about the contract's terms, her subtle French accent, it all combined to create an allure he couldn't ignore. "Miss Voller," he said one afternoon, catching her after a medical consultation review, "perhaps we could discuss these terms over dinner? Somewhere private?" Antoinette's polite refusal was kind but firm. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Francis, given the circumstances." The rejection only intensified his fascination. During meetings with Charles, Tom found himself watching how his client's eyes followed Antoinette's movements, noting the subtle changes in the typically stoic billionaire's demeanor when she was present. The staff, too, began noticing unusual patterns. Charles, who normally dined alone in his study, started appearing in the formal dining room each evening. His late-night work sessions increasingly relocated to the study adjacent to the music room, especially when Antoinette was playing. "He's different around her," Marcus Chen observed to Stephanie one evening. "More human." But the real complications emerged when Sarah Mitchell made her first move. She arranged to run into Charles at their old favorite restaurant, the Bernardine, knowing his habits hadn't changed. "Charles," she purred, approaching his table. "What a surprise!" He stiffened visibly. "Sarah, what do you want?" "Can't ex-spouses be civil?" She slid uninvited into the chair opposite him, especially when they share concerns about certain arrangements. Charles's face hardened. "What are you talking about?" "Your new house guest." "Really, Charles? A homeless woman? Have you lost your mind? Or is this some kind of midlife crisis?" "My personal affairs are no longer your concern." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They are when they affect company stability. The board won't look kindly on scandal, especially not now, during the Jensen merger negotiations." The threat was clear. Charles remained outwardly calm, but his hand tightened around his wine glass. "Is that why you're here? To threaten me?" "To warn you." As someone who once cared, Sarah's smile was predatory. "Whatever game you're playing with this woman, it ends badly. You know that better than anyone." Back at the mansion, Antoinette was facing her own crisis. Morning sickness had hit hard, complicated by memories of her past life that refused to stay buried. During one particularly difficult morning, she found herself hunched over the bathroom sink, tears mixing with the water splashing her face. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Miss Voller," Stephanie's voice called. "Mr. Woodward asked me to check on you. He heard you were unwell." The concern surprised her. It wasn't part of their contract. this unexpected attention to her comfort. Just as surprising was the delivery that arrived that afternoon: ginger tea, crackers and other remedies for morning sickness, all arranged with typical Woodward efficiency. But perhaps the most complicated development was the one neither Charles nor Antoinette would acknowledge: the growing tension between them. It manifested in small moments: their fingers brushing during contract reviews, shared glances over dinner, the way they both found reasons to be in the music room at the same time. One evening, as Chopin's Raindrop Prelude filled the mansion, Charles found himself standing in the music room doorway, watching Antoinette play. The sight of her at his piano, lost in the music, stirred something he'd thought long dead. "That's beautiful," he said softly when she finished. She turned, startled. "I'm sorry, I should have asked permission." "No," he stepped into the room. "This piano. It hasn't been played since my mother died. It's good to hear music in the house again." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Then Charles abruptly turned and left, leaving Antoinette alone with the lingering notes and the growing realization that their carefully constructed arrangement was becoming something far more complicated than either anticipated. The first signs of trouble came during a routine checkup at Mount Sinai Hospital. Dr. Emily Richardson studied the ultrasound screen with growing concern, her practiced composure slipping slightly as she moved the probe across Antoinette's abdomen. "Well," she said carefully, "I have some unexpected news. MS. Voila, Mr. Woodward. You're expecting triplets." The silence in the examination room was absolute. Charles, who had been standing by the window checking emails on his phone, suddenly went very still. Antoinette's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and fear. "Triplets," Charles's voice was unusually strained. "Are you certain?" Dr. Richardson nodded, pointing to the screen. 3 distinct heartbeats. "And while multiple pregnancies are generally higher risk, there's something else we need to discuss." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "MS. Vola's blood work shows some concerning patterns." The diagnosis came like a thunderbolt: preeclampsia, complicated by an underlying heart condition that Antoinette's years on the street had left untreated. The pristine medical office seemed to shrink as Dr. Richardson outlined the risks. "This pregnancy will be extremely high risk," she explained. "MS Vola will need constant monitoring, complete bed rest, and there's a significant chance we'll need to deliver early. Even then, there are no guarantees for either the mother or the babies." Charles's business instincts kicked in immediately. What's the best course of action? The finest specialists, private nursing, whatever it takes. But it was Antoinette's quiet voice that stopped his flow of solutions. "And the children? What are their chances?" Dr. Richardson's expression softened. "With proper care, they have a good chance. But MS Vola, you need to understand, carrying this pregnancy to term puts your own life at significant risk." The drive back to the mansion was silent, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Charles gripped the steering wheel of his Lamborghini so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Antoinette stared out the window, one hand resting protectively on her barely visible bump. "We need to discuss options," Charles finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "The contract has provisions for medical complications, if you choose to terminate." No, Antoinette's response was immediate, firm. "They're alive. I can feel them." She turned to face him, her blue eyes bright with determination. "I won't give up on them." Back at the mansion, the news spread quickly among the staff. Stephanie immediately began converting one of the largest guest suites into a medical room, coordinating with the team of specialists Charles had already summoned. Marcus Chen doubled the security detail, knowing the media would soon be hunting for stories about the Woodward heir, or rather heirs. That evening, Charles found himself drawn to the music room, where Antoinette sat at the piano, not playing, just resting her fingers on the silent keys. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "The contract doesn't require you to risk your life." She smiled faintly. Some things are beyond contracts. Charles, her use of his first name hung in the air between them. These babies. They're not just legal obligations, they're little miracles growing inside me. I can't explain it, but I already love them. The word love made Charles flinch visibly. He turned away, facing the window. Love is dangerous. It makes people irrational, takes away their ability to make sound decisions. Like the decision to save 3 lives at the risk of my own, Antoinette's voice held a gentle challenge. Perhaps some decisions should come from the heart rather than the head. The weeks that followed brought a parade of specialists through the mansion. Antoinette's suite became a sophisticated medical unit, with monitoring equipment and round-the-clock nursing care. Charles spared no expense, but for the first time in his life, money didn't give him the control he craved. Each new complication, each worried consultation with Dr. Richardson, chipped away at his carefully constructed walls. He found himself lingering outside Antoinette's door late at night, listening to the steady beep of monitoring equipment, fighting an unfamiliar urge to go in, to offer comfort, to acknowledge the growing fear that twisted in his chest whenever he thought about losing her. One particularly difficult night, as he passed by her room, he heard soft crying. Without thinking, he opened the door. Antoinette lay in her medical bed, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. "They're moving," she whispered when she saw him. Would you like to feel?" Charles hesitated, then slowly approached the bed. When she took his hand and placed it on her stomach, the tiny flutter beneath his palm shattered something fundamental inside him. These weren't just contractual obligations or potential heirs, they were his children. And their mother was no longer just a surrogate, but someone who had become impossibly precious to him. "We'll get through this," he found himself promising, his voice rough with emotion. "Whatever it takes, I'll keep you safe, all of you." The annual Manhattan Children's Hospital Charity Gala was the kind of event Charles Woodward typically navigated on autopilot: shake hands, write checks, maintain appropriate distance. But this evening was different. With Antoinette on his arm, carefully dressed to conceal her growing pregnancy, he found himself hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered comment. She looked stunning in a carefully chosen midnight blue gown, her natural grace drawing attention despite her efforts to remain inconspicuous. Charles had insisted on her attendance, arguing that her presence would help quell rumors, but now he was beginning to regret the decision. Charles Woodward, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. And this must be the mysterious lady we've all been hearing about. Margaret Wellington, Manhattan's most notorious socialite, stood before them, her smile sharp as a razor. "Tell us, dear, how does one go from the streets to the arms of New York's most eligible bachelor?" The ballroom seemed to freeze. Charles felt Antoinette stiffen beside him, but before he could intervene, she spoke. "The same way one goes from 3 failed marriages to becoming Manhattan's most notorious gossip, I suppose," Antoinette replied in perfect, cultured French-accented English, "through life's interesting turns." Charles felt something unfamiliar bubble up in his chest, pride, mixed with an overwhelming urge to protect her. Without thinking, he placed his hand on the small of her back. "I believe they're about to begin the auction, Margaret. Shall we find our seats?" Later that evening, as they escaped to a quiet balcony, Charles found himself studying Antoinette's profile in the moonlight. "You handled that remarkably well." She gave a small laugh. "I've played in front of crowned heads of Europe, Charles. One socialite with an inflated sense of importance hardly registers. Still, you shouldn't have to deal with their cruelty." "Why not?" "Because I'm just a surrogate?" A business arrangement, her voice held a challenge. The question hung between them, demanding an answer Charles wasn't ready to give. Instead, he noticed her slight shiver in the evening breeze and automatically removed his jacket, draping it over her shoulders. The gesture, so natural yet so intimate, caused them both to pause. For a moment they stood close enough to feel each other's warmth, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. Charles, her voice was barely a whisper. What are we doing? Before he could answer, a commotion inside drew their attention. Tom Francis stood in the doorway, his face unusually flushed. Charles, we have a situation. Sarah's here, and she's talking to the press. The moment shattered. Charles immediately shifted back into business mode, but as he turned to handle the crisis, Antoinette swayed slightly. Without hesitation, he caught her elbow. "You're not well," he said, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine, just tired. The babies." The word babies did something to him, breaking through his professional facade. In that moment, watching her try to maintain composure while carrying his children, something shifted irreversibly in his heart. Marcus, he called to his security chief. "Take Miss Voller home immediately, through the private exit." But as he helped her into the car, his hand lingered on hers longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and the emotion that passed between them had nothing to do with contracts or obligations. Back at the mansion, unable to sleep, Charles found himself drawn to the music room. The piano sat silent in the moonlight, but he could almost hear the ghost of Antoinette's music. When had her playing become as essential to his home as the air he breathed? "She's changing you," Stephanie observed quietly from the doorway, breaking into his thoughts. "She's carrying my children," he replied automatically. "Is that all she's carrying, Mr. Woodward?" The housekeeper's knowing tone made him turn. "I've served you for 20 years. I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her." "It's complicated." "Love usually is," Stephanie's words hung in the air as she left him alone with his thoughts. Later that night, passing Antoinette's room, he heard her cry out in her sleep. Without thinking, he rushed in. She was tangled in her sheets, clearly in the grip of a nightmare. "Antoinette," he called softly, touching her shoulder. "Wake up. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, filled with tears and remembered fear. "Charles, I'm here." She gripped his hand, and instead of pulling away as he once would have, he found himself sitting on the edge of her bed, holding her until her breathing steadied. "Stay," she whispered. "Just for a while." And he did, watching over her as she fell back asleep, his heart opening to feelings he'd thought long buried. In the quiet darkness, the truth he'd been fighting became undeniable. He was falling in love with the mother of his children. The storm broke 3 days after the charity gala. Sarah Mitchell's calculated attack came in the form of a front page expose in the New York Times Woodward heir scandal, the dark truth behind the mystery woman. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and half-truths, painting Antoinette as a sophisticated con artist who had orchestrated her seemingly chance meeting with Charles. It detailed her past performances at prestigious venues, her sudden disappearance from the European music scene, and hinted at suspicious financial dealings. Charles was in his office at Woodward Capital when the story broke. Marcus Chen appeared at his door, tablet in hand. "Sir, you need to see this." As he read, Charles's face hardened into a mask that his employees knew well, the expression that preceded corporate warfare. But beneath his controlled exterior, an unfamiliar emotion raged: fear, not for himself, but for Antoinette. "Get the car," he ordered, "and call Tom. We need to contain this." At the mansion, Antoinette sat in her medical suite, trembling hands holding the newspaper. The article had dredged up everything she'd tried to forget, including a name she'd hoped never to see again: James Cooper. "He claims you were his accomplice," Stephanie said gently, taking the paper from her, "that you helped him con other wealthy patrons before disappearing with your share." "It's not true," Antoinette whispered. "He took everything from me. My money, my career, my dignity." The sound of running footsteps interrupted them. Charles burst into the room, his usual composure noticeably strained. "Antoinette!" "I should leave," she said quietly. "This publicity, it's not good for you or the babies." No, his response was immediate, forceful. "You're not going anywhere, we'll fight this." But the threats were just beginning. That afternoon, Charles received a call from his sister Elizabeth. "The family board is meeting tomorrow," she warned. "They're concerned about the company's reputation. Some are talking about forcing you to step down." The Woodward family, old money dating back to New York's founding, had always maintained strict control over their empire. Charles might be CEO, but the family board held the power to remove him if they deemed him unfit. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell made her next move. A legal petition arrived demanding a review of Charles's mental competency to lead Woodward Capital, citing his erratic behavior and questionable associations. Tom Francis worked through the night, preparing legal defenses, but his heart wasn't in it. Every document he read about Antoinette's past only deepened his fascination with her. The story of her betrayal by James Cooper read like a tragic opera, and her subsequent fall from grace touched something deep within him. The pressure mounted as more media outlets picked up the story. Reporters camped outside the mansion, their cameras capturing every movement. Charles's security team worked overtime, screening threats and intercepting attempts to breach the property. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Emily Richardson arrived for Antoinette's weekly checkup with grave news. "The stress is affecting the babies," she explained, showing them the latest test results. "If this continues, we may need to consider early delivery to save them." The publicity, the tension, it's all creating dangerous complications. Charles stood by the window of the medical suite, his back rigid with suppressed emotion. What if we moved her? Somewhere private, away from all this? Moving her in this condition would be extremely risky, Dr. Richardson cautioned. Antoinette watched this exchange silently, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Finally, she spoke. "There's only one way to end this. I need to tell my story, the whole truth." "Absolutely not," Charles turned sharply. "In your condition." "These are my babies too," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "And I won't have them born into a world where their mother is seen as a criminal. I won't have them ashamed of who they are." The room fell silent. Charles stared at her, suddenly seeing not the vulnerable woman he'd contracted to bear his children, but a mother fierce in her determination to protect her young. "If we do this," he said finally, "we do it together. No more contracts, no more hiding. Whatever comes, we face it." As he hesitated, then finished softly, "as a family." The word hung in the air between them, changing everything. Outside, reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, but inside that room, something fundamental had shifted. The external threats had done what no contract could. They had forged a bond stronger than legal obligations, deeper than social expectations. The transformation of the Woodward mansion happened so gradually that even Stephanie, with her keen eye for detail, couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began. Perhaps it started with the way Charles moved his morning meetings to the sunroom adjacent to Antoinette's medical suite, or how the austere halls began filling with the sound of classical music from the rebuilt sound system he had installed throughout the house. Small changes accumulated like snowflakes, building into an avalanche. Charles's usual late nights at the office became rare as he found himself drawn home earlier each evening. His customary solitary dinners in his study gave way to shared meals with Antoinette in her suite, where they would talk for hours about music, art, and life. "Tell me about your mother," Antoinette asked one evening, as they sat watching the sunset from her private balcony. The piano was hers, wasn't it? Charles was silent for a long moment, swirling the water in his glass. He'd given up alcohol in solidarity with her pregnancy. She was music itself. Everything beautiful in my childhood came from her. When she died, it was like all the music died with her. "Until now," Antoinette said softly, her hand resting on her growing belly. Their eyes met, and Charles felt something shift inside him. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand next to hers, feeling the baby's move. These moments had become increasingly frequent unplanned touches, shared glances, conversations that stretched into the night. The staff noticed the changes in their employer. The infamous Woodward temper, once the terror of board meetings, mellowed. They caught him smiling at his phone, looking at the ultrasound pictures Dr. Richardson had sent. The man who once demanded absolute silence in his home now stopped to listen when Antoinette played the piano, his face softening in a way none of them had ever seen. One morning, Marcus found Charles in the mansion's unused nursery, personally directing the renovation team. "The room needs more natural light," he was saying. "And the cribs should face east. I've read babies sleep better that way." The security chief hid his smile. This was a far cry from the man who once considered children merely necessary heirs to his empire. Even the kitchen staff felt the change. Charles began taking an interest in the meals, ensuring they met not just the nutritionist's requirements but Antoinette's occasional cravings. The chef nearly fainted when Charles himself walked into the kitchen at midnight to learn how to make the traditional French soup Antoinette had mentioned missing from her childhood. "Mr. Woodward," Stephanie said, "finding him practicing the recipe the next day I could have arranged for someone." "No," he interrupted, focused on chopping vegetables. Some things you need to do yourself." The growing bond between them manifested in countless small ways. Charles installed a telescope in Antoinette's room after discovering her love of stars. She, in turn, began teaching him piano during her stronger moments, their fingers occasionally brushing on the keys, sending electricity through both of them. Late one night, during a particularly bad thunderstorm, Charles found Antoinette in the music room, unable to sleep. Without a word, he sat beside her on the piano bench as she played Chopin's Raindrop Prelude, the music merging with the storm outside in perfect harmony. "My mother played this during storms too," he said quietly when she finished. Antoinette turned to him, their faces close in the dim light. "She must have been remarkable." "She would have loved you," he replied, then seemed startled by his own words. The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. But before either could speak, one of the babies kicked forcefully, making Antoinette gasp. Charles immediately placed his hand on her belly, their fingers intertwining naturally over the spot. "They know your voice," she whispered. "They always move more when you're near." The simple observation struck Charles like a physical blow. These weren't just heirs anymore, they were his children, part of him, part of her, and Antoinette. She had become something he couldn't define, something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. The first sign of serious trouble came during a crucial board meeting at Woodward Capital. Charles was presenting the company's quarterly projections when his sister Elizabeth burst into the room, her face ashen. "The Jensen merger," she said without preamble. "Someone leaked the confidential terms to our competitors." The room erupted in chaos. The Jensen merger had been Charles's masterstroke, a billion-dollar deal that would have secured Woodward Capital's dominance in the Asian markets. Within hours, their stock price began to plummet. But worse news was waiting at home. Dr. Richardson's latest tests showed an alarming development in Antoinette's condition. The strain on her heart was increasing, and one of the triplets showed signs of distress. "We need to consider selective reduction," Dr. Richardson suggested gently, "to give the other two babies a better chance." The color drained from Antoinette's face. "No," she said firmly, "I won't sacrifice any of them." Charles, standing by the window, felt torn between his business crisis and the medical one. When his phone buzzed with another emergency from the office, he saw Antoinette flinch at the sound. "Go," she said softly. "Your company needs you." But as he turned to leave, he caught sight of her reflection in the window pane, determined and utterly alone. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. "The company can wait," he said, moving to sit beside her. "This is where I need to be." That evening, Tom Francis arrived with more disturbing news. Sarah Mitchell had been seen meeting with James Cooper, Antoinette's former fiancé who had stolen her fortune. The timing couldn't be coincidental. They're planning something, Tom warned. Something big. He was right. The next morning, every major financial newspaper carried the story: Woodward Capital CEO involved in French music industry scandal. The articles painted Charles and Antoinette as co-conspirators in an elaborate scheme, using Cooper's old accusations as a foundation for new lies. The family board called an emergency meeting. Charles's uncle Richard, the family patriarch, didn't mince words. Step down voluntarily, he advised, or we'll be forced to remove you. The Woodward name can't weather this scandal. Charles stood at the head of the boardroom table, looking at the faces of his relatives, people who had known him since childhood, now ready to cast him aside to protect their precious reputation. "If you want my resignation," he said coldly, "you'll have to force it. And I promise you, it will be the most expensive battle this family has ever fought." But even as he fought for his corporate survival, Antoinette's condition worsened. The stress of the scandal, combined with her already precarious health, pushed her body to its limits. One night he found her trying to pack a small bag, her hands shaking with effort. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I'm destroying everything you've built," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Your company, your family's trust, your reputation." Charles crossed the room in 3 strides, taking the bag from her hands. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice intense. "None of that matters. The company, the money, the Woodward name, it's all replaceable. You and our children are not. But your whole life's work is worth nothing without you." The words hung in the air between them, surprising them both with their raw honesty. That night, as Antoinette finally slept, Charles made a series of calls. By morning, his personal fortune had been moved to secure accounts, key executives had been replaced with loyal allies, and a plan was in motion to protect what really mattered. But Sarah Mitchell had one more card to play. Through her connections, she managed to freeze Charles's assets, citing potential criminal activity. Simultaneously, James Cooper filed a civil suit against Antoinette, claiming rights to any money she might receive from the Woodward family. The pressure reached its peak when Dr. Richardson arrived for an emergency visit. Antoinette's latest test showed critical complications. Without immediate intervention, they could lose everything. Standing in the medical suite, watching the woman he loved fight for their children's lives while his empire crumbled around him, Charles Woodward finally understood what true wealth meant, and he was prepared to sacrifice everything to protect it. The story broke on a cold Tuesday morning. Not in the financial papers or society pages, but in the local community newsletter of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Father Michael had sheltered Antoinette during her darkest days, published a simple but powerful account of her true story. "I watched this young woman play our old church piano for the homeless," he wrote. "Her music gave hope to those who had none. Now she needs our help." The response was immediate and unexpected. The homeless community Antoinette had once belonged to began gathering outside the Woodward mansion, not to protest or cause trouble, but to hold a quiet vigil. They brought candles, flowers, and stories. "She shared her food with me when she had almost nothing," one elderly woman told reporters. "She played music in the shelter at Christmas to lift our spirits." Marcus Chen, monitoring the growing crowd from the security office, was moved by their peaceful presence. "Mr. Woodward," he reported, "these people, they're protecting her." Indeed, the homeless community formed a human barrier between the mansion and the aggressive paparazzi, their quiet dignity more effective than any security detail. They sang the classical pieces Antoinette had taught them, their rough voices carrying surprising grace. Inside the mansion, Charles watched this unfold with growing amazement. "I never knew," he said softly, standing by Antoinette's bedside. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" She smiled weakly. "Some things aren't meant to be told, Charles. They're meant to be lived." The story spread through New York's artistic community. Musicians who had known Antoinette from her conservatory days began speaking out. The truth about James Cooper's crimes emerged as other victims found the courage to come forward. The French consulate became involved, launching an investigation into Cooper's activities. Evidence surfaced of his systematic targeting of young artists, with Sarah Mitchell's financial firm handling the stolen funds. But perhaps the most surprising support came from within the Woodward mansion itself. The staff, led by Stephanie, organized a petition defending Charles's leadership. Every employee, from the gardeners to the executive assistants, signed it. "We've served the Woodward family for generations," Stephanie told the board, "and never have we seen this house more alive, more full of genuine purpose than it is now." The kitchen staff shared stories of Antoinette's kindness, how she learned all their names, remembered their children's birthdays, asked about their families. The security team spoke of her quiet strength, how she never complained despite her condition. Even Elizabeth, Charles's sister, found herself swayed by the groundswell of support. During a tense family dinner, she finally spoke up. "Do you remember when Mother died?" she asked Charles. "How empty this house became. Listen now." Through the open windows came the sound of singing from the vigil outside, mixed with the soft notes of the piano from Antoinette's room where she taught local children during her stronger moments. "This isn't just about money or reputation anymore," Elizabeth continued. "This is about life returning to our family." The community's support manifested in unexpected ways. Local restaurants sent food for the vigil participants. Music students from Juilliard performed daily concerts outside the mansion. The church organized prayer groups. But when Sarah Mitchell attempted to stage a press conference attacking Antoinette's character, she found herself confronted by a group of homeless men and women who had known the real story. Their quiet testimony, broadcast live, did more damage to her credibility than any corporate lawyer could have achieved. Inside the mansion, Antoinette's strength was fading, but her spirit remained unbroken. She insisted on playing the piano daily, even if just for a few minutes, knowing the music carried to those gathering outside. "Music connects hearts," she told Charles. "It reminds us we're not alone." One evening, as the sun set over Manhattan, Charles stood at the window watching the vigil below. The sight of hundreds of candles flickering in the gathering dark, held by people from all walks of life, moved something deep within him. "I've spent my life building walls," he admitted to Antoinette. "You've spent yours building bridges." She reached for his hand, guiding it to feel the babies moving within her. "Then let's build something new together," she whispered. "Something that combines both strength and compassion." The community's embrace had changed more than just public opinion. It had transformed Charles Woodward's understanding of true wealth and power. As he watched over Antoinette that night, listening to the gentle hymns floating up from below, he realized that some fortunes couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The moment of truth came at 3:47 a.m. on a stormy October morning. Dr. Richardson burst into the master bedroom where Charles had taken to sleeping on a couch near Antoinette's medical bed. "We need to decide now," she said urgently. "Her heart can't take much more. We either deliver the babies immediately or risk losing all of them." Antoinette was barely conscious, her face pale against the pillows. The monitors showed her heartbeat growing weaker with each passing moment. Charles gripped her hand, feeling her fingers flutter weakly against his palm. "The babies," she whispered. "They're too small." Dr. Richardson's face was grave. "At 28 weeks they have a chance." But waiting, she left the sentence unfinished, its implications hanging heavy in the air. Charles felt the weight of the moment crushing him. The contract they'd signed months ago gave him full medical authority, the power to make this decision alone. But staring at Antoinette's face, seeing the love and fear battling in her eyes, he knew this wasn't about contracts anymore. "It's your choice," he said softly to Antoinette. "I trust you." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded. "Save them," she whispered. "Promise me you'll save them." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Mount Sinai's top surgical team was assembled. The mansion's security coordinated with police to clear a route to the hospital through the gathered crowds outside. Just before they took her to surgery, Antoinette grabbed Charles's hand with surprising strength. "If something happens, play music for them. Promise me, like your mother did for you." He couldn't speak, could only nod as they wheeled her away. In the waiting room, Charles faced another crisis. His phone buzzed constantly with news from Woodward Capital. Sarah Mitchell had convinced enough board members to call for an emergency vote on his leadership. His entire empire teetered on the brink. Sir Marcus said quietly, holding out a tablet, "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes. They're waiting for you to video conference in." Charles stared at the tablet, then through the window to the operating room where Antoinette fought for their children's lives. The choice suddenly seemed absurdly simple. "Tell them to go ahead without me," he said, never taking his eyes off the operating room door. "And Marcus, sell my shares, all of them." Sir Marcus's usual composure cracked. That would mean losing control of the company. Yes, Charles's voice was calm. But some things are worth more than power. The surgery stretched on for hours. Charles paced the waiting room, stopping only when Tom Francis arrived with urgent news. "Sarah's made her move," Tom reported. "She's offering to buy your shares at half their value, claiming the scandal has tainted them." "Let her have them," Charles replied. "But first, transfer enough to secure Antoinette and the children's future. Put it in an ironclad trust." Tom hesitated. "Charles, that would mean giving up almost everything you've built." No, Charles turned to face his longtime lawyer and friend. "Everything I've built that matters is in that operating room." As dawn broke over Manhattan, Dr. Richardson emerged, her surgical scrubs showing signs of the battle they'd fought through the night. "The babies are alive," she announced. Small, but fighting. She paused. "Antoinette, we lost her twice on the table. She's stable now, but the next 24 hours are critical." Charles felt his knees buckle. Stephanie, who had arrived sometime during the night, steadied him. "Can I see them?" The NICU was eerily quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. 3 impossibly tiny beings lay in their incubators, each smaller than Charles's hand. Standing there, watching their miniature chests rise and fall, he made another decision. Pulling out his phone, he dialed his sister. "Elizabeth, I need you to arrange something. Find every specialist, every expert in premature infant care. Price is no object." "But Charles," she hesitated, "after selling your shares." "Then sell my properties. The art collection. Everything. These children and their mother, they're all that matters now." In Antoinette's recovery room, Charles pulled a chair close to her bed. Taking her limp hand in his, he began to hum softly the same Chopin nocturne his mother had played during storms. "Choose me," he whispered. "Choose us. I'll give up everything else, just please, stay." Days in the NICU blurred together as Charles divided his time between his fragile newborns and Antoinette's bedside. The mighty CEO who once commanded boardrooms now learned to change tiny diapers with trembling hands, to read oxygen saturation monitors, to understand the complex symphony of medical machinery keeping his family alive. The transformation in him was profound and visible. His expensive suits gave way to comfortable clothes that could withstand hours of skin-to-skin contact with the babies. His perfectly manicured hands became rough from constant sanitizing. The man who once measured time in fiscal quarters now counted progress in grams gained and milliliters of milk consumed. "You've changed," Elizabeth observed, finding him singing softly to the smallest triplet, a tiny girl they'd named Grace. "I've never seen you like this." Charles didn't look up from his daughter's face. I was wrong about so many things, Elizabeth. Success, power, control, none of it matters when you're watching your child fight for every breath. In Antoinette's room, he spent hours talking to her unconscious form, sharing every detail of the baby's progress. The nurses found him practicing piano on a small keyboard he'd brought in, determined to keep his promise about music. The latest brain research shows music helps premature babies develop, he explained to anyone who would listen, sounding more like an eager new father than a corporate titan. When Antoinette finally opened her eyes after 5 days, her first weak question was about the babies. Charles showed her photos on his phone, his voice breaking as he described each tiny milestone. "They're fighters," he said, "just like their mother." Her recovery was slow, complicated by the strain on her heart. But Charles approached it with the same determination he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. He learned medical terminology, questioned doctors, researched treatments. The man who once delegated everything now insisted on being hands-on in every aspect of care. The nurses nicknamed him the hovering hawk for his constant vigilance, but there was affection in their teasing. They saw how he tenderly fed Antoinette ice chips, how he played classical music in both rooms, how he read medical journals late into the night. One evening, Tom found him in the hospital chapel, head bowed. The board meeting concluded. Tom reported softly, "Sarah Mitchell is the new CEO of Woodward Capital." Charles nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the flickering candles. "How are the shares performing?" "Down 30%. The market's uncertain about the transition." And yet Charles smiled slightly. "For the first time in my life, I'm certain about what matters." The babies grew stronger day by day. Charles learned each one's personality grace, the smallest but most determined Alexander, calm and steady, and Sophie, who calmed instantly when she heard Antoinette's voice. Antoinette watched him with their children, seeing how the man who once viewed them as mere heirs now melted at their every gesture. "You're a natural father," she observed softly. "I had an excellent teacher," he replied, taking her hand. "You taught me how to love them before they were even born." The media chronicled his transformation with fascination. "Billionaire chooses family over fortune," read one headline. The public, who had once seen him as a cold corporate raider, now watched him navigate fatherhood with endearing determination. Even the Woodward family board members who had opposed him began to see him differently. His uncle Richard visited the NICU and found Charles patiently explaining Debussy to the triplets. Perhaps, Richard admitted to Elizabeth later, we judged him too harshly. As Antoinette regained strength, she began teaching Charles proper lullabies. Their duets on the small keyboard became a hospital highlight, with staff and patients gathering to listen. "Music heals," she told him. "It always has." The man who once measured success in dollars and cents now counted it in smiles, in tiny fingers gripping his, in the way Antoinette's eyes lit up when she held their children. "I spent years building walls," he confessed to her one night, "teaching myself not to feel, not to need anyone. But you and these babies, you've torn down every wall I ever built." The first signs of unexpected support came from the hospital staff. Nurses volunteered for extra shifts in the NICU, therapists offered free services, and even the hospital's administrative staff worked to navigate insurance complexities as Charles's financial situation changed. The story of the Woodward triplets and their parents' sacrifice had touched hearts throughout Mount Sinai. Dr. Richardson rallied her medical colleagues, bringing in specialists who offered their services at reduced rates or pro bono. "Medicine isn't always about business," she told her department heads. "Sometimes it's about being part of a miracle." But the real surprise came from the artistic community. Word spread through Manhattan's musical circles about Antoinette's situation. The response was overwhelming. Famous pianists began performing benefit concerts, with proceeds going to the triplets' medical care. One morning, Charles arrived at the NICU to find a world-renowned cellist playing Bach beside the incubators. The baby's vital signs noticeably improved during the performance. Music was her gift. To others, the cellist explained simply, "Now it's our turn to give back." The homeless community that had maintained their vigil outside the Woodward mansion organized a fundraising drive. It wasn't the amount they raised that moved Charles, it was watching people who had almost nothing giving what they could. "She played for us when we were hopeless," one man told reporters. "Her music reminded us we were still human." Stephanie coordinated these efforts from the mansion, turning the grand ballroom into a command center. The staff worked tirelessly, managing donations, organizing support, and maintaining communication with the growing network of supporters. Even the media narrative shifted. Journalists who had once gleefully reported on the scandal now wrote touching pieces about love, sacrifice, and redemption. The New York Times ran a featured article titled "The Price of Love: A Billionaire's Choice" that brought tears to readers' eyes. The French consulate, moved by Antoinette's story, expedited investigations into James Cooper's fraud. Evidence mounted rapidly as other victims came forward, encouraged by her bravery. Miss Vola's courage has inspired others to speak, the French consul announced. "Justice may be slow, but it is coming." Perhaps most surprisingly, support came from within the financial world. Junior executives at Woodward Capital, remembering Charles's mentorship, began quietly resigning in protest of Sarah Mitchell's leadership. Major clients, hearing of his sacrifice for family, transferred their business to firms that shared his values. The hospital's pediatric ward transformed into an impromptu concert hall as musicians continued to perform. The music helped not just the Woodward triplets but all the young patients. Watching this, Charles began to understand the ripple effect of compassion. One evening, Elizabeth arrived with unexpected news. "The family board is meeting again," she announced. Uncle Richard called it. And Charles, holding Grace during her feeding, didn't even look up. "It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters," Elizabeth insisted, "because they've seen who you've become. The man who would sacrifice an empire for love is the kind of man they want leading the family legacy." The support culminated in a citywide fundraising gala, organized by the unlikely coalition of Manhattan's elite and the homeless community. The event was held simultaneously at the Metropolitan Opera House in St. Patrick's Cathedral, bridging social divides in a way no one had thought possible. Antoinette, watching the coverage from her hospital room, squeezed Charles's hand. "Look what love can do," she whispered. "It builds bridges where walls once stood." Charles looked at their 3 babies, now growing stronger each day, at the woman he loved regaining her strength, at the community that had rallied around them, and understood that he hadn't lost an empire, he'd gained something far more valuable. "I used to think power came from controlling everything," he told her. "Now I know it comes from letting love change you." The crisis struck without warning on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Charles was in the NICU, carefully holding Alexander during his feeding time, when alarms suddenly blared from Antoinette's room down the hall. "Code blue, room 742. Code blue, room 742. The sound of running feet and urgent voices filled the corridor. Charles's world narrowed to a tunnel as he gently placed Alexander back in his incubator and ran toward Antoinette's room, his heart pounding in his throat. Dr. Richardson blocked his path at the door. "Charles, you need to let us work." Through the gap, he caught glimpses of the horrifying scene, Antoinette's lifeless form arching as doctors applied defibrillator paddles, the steady tone of a flatlined heart monitor, the controlled chaos of medical staff fighting death itself. "Clear," a doctor shouted. Antoinette's body jerked with the electrical charge. No response. Again. Clear. Time seemed to stop. Charles pressed his forehead against the cold hospital wall, memories flooding his mind. Antoinette at the piano, her first smile when she felt the babies move, the way she hummed French lullabies during ultrasounds. "Please," he whispered, not sure who he was begging. "Please don't take her." Elizabeth arrived to find him slumped in a chair outside the room, looking older than she'd ever seen him. The mighty Charles Woodward, who had once commanded Wall Street, reduced to helpless waiting. "The babies need you," she reminded him gently. "You have to be strong for them." But strength felt impossible as the minutes stretched into hours. The medical team worked tirelessly, fighting complications from the birth that had quietly worsened. Charles paced the hallway, alternating between Antoinette's room and the NICU, torn between the woman he loved and the children they'd created. Dr. Richardson emerged periodically with updates, each more concerning than the last. "Her heart is struggling, kidney function declining. We're doing everything we can." The news spread quickly through the hospital. Staff who had come to know and love the family gathered quietly in nearby waiting areas, offering silent support. Musicians who had been performing for the babies redirected their music to the hallway outside Antoinette's room, filling the air with gentle melodies. As night fell, the situation grew more desperate. The doctors had stabilized her heart, but other systems were failing. Charles sat by her bed, holding her cold hand, watching her chest rise and fall with the help of machines. "Do you remember," he whispered to her still form, "the first night you played my mother's piano? I stood in the doorway, pretending to be annoyed, but really I was feeling something I thought I'd never feel again." His voice broke. "You brought music back into my life, Antoinette. You can't leave us now. The children need their mother's music. I need you." In the NICU, the triplets seemed to sense something was wrong. They grew fussy, their vital signs fluctuating until a nurse had the idea to play a recording of Antoinette's piano music. The babies settled immediately, recognizing their mother's musical touch. Near midnight, Dr. Richardson delivered the hardest news yet. "Her body is shutting down, Charles. We need to prepare for the possibility." No, his response was immediate, fierce. "She's stronger than this. She's fought too hard to give up now." But as the machines beeped their ominous rhythm, even Charles had to face the terrible possibility of losing her. The thought of raising their children alone, of never hearing her play again, of all the moments they'd never share. Elizabeth found him in the hospital chapel at dawn, tears streaming down his face as he played the small piano there, his fingers stumbling through the Chopin piece Antoinette had been teaching him. "I don't know how to do this without her," he admitted brokenly. "I don't know how to be the parent they need." The sound of running footsteps interrupted them. A nurse burst into the chapel, breathless. "Mr. Woodward, come quickly, she's—" Tom Francis arrived at Mount Sinai Hospital with a thick folder under his arm and a grim expression on his face. He found Charles in his usual spot between the NICU and Antoinette's room, looking exhausted from another night of vigil. "You need to see this," Tom said, laying out documents on a small table. "We've uncovered everything." But the evidence was damning. Sarah Mitchell's conspiracy ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Bank records showed she had been working with James Cooper for years, targeting wealthy individuals through elaborate schemes. Antoinette hadn't been their first victim, she had been their most successful one until they set their sights on Charles. "They planned this from the beginning," Tom explained, his voice tight with anger. Sarah knew about Antoinette's past. She had Cooper drive her to homelessness, knowing Charles's morning route, planning their chance meeting. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. The contract, the pregnancy, was meant to be their masterpiece. They expected you to reject her when her past came to light, making you appear heartless. The scandal would have forced you out, and Sarah would have taken control of everything. But their plan had one fatal flaw: they hadn't counted on love. As Tom continued revealing the conspiracy, more betrayals came to light. members of the Woodward family board had been secretly accepting bribes. Trusted executives had been feeding information to Sarah. Even some of the hospital staff had been paid to report on Antoinette's condition. There's more. Tom hesitated. About Cooper. Before he could continue, Marcus Chen burst into the room. "Sir, you need to see this. Sarah Mitchell is holding a press conference." On the hospital room's small TV, Sarah stood before a forest of microphones, her practiced smile in place. "I am here to announce that Woodward Capital will be pursuing legal action against Charles Woodward and his companion. The evidence of their conspiracy is overwhelming." Charles watched, his fury building, as Sarah spun her web of lies. But then something unexpected happened. A figure pushed through the crowd of reporters, James Cooper himself, looking disheveled and nervous. "It's all lies," Cooper announced, his voice shaking. "I can't do this anymore. Sarah Mitchell paid me to destroy Antoinette's life, to set up this whole situation. I have proof." The press conference dissolved into chaos. Cameras swiveled to capture Cooper's confession as security dragged him away. Sarah's composed facade cracked, showing the panic beneath. But the revelations weren't finished. Tom pulled out one final document, a DNA test. "Cooper had another reason for confessing," Tom said quietly. "He's my brother." Charles stared at his longtime lawyer and friend. "What?" "I didn't know at first," Tom explained, his voice thick with emotion. "When I saw Antoinette's file, something seemed familiar. I started digging into my own past, my adopted parents. Cooper James Mitchell is my biological brother. When I confronted him with the truth, he broke down and confessed everything." The weight of this revelation hung heavy in the room. Tom's strange behavior, his fascination with Antoinette, his recent distraction, it all made sense now. "Sarah found out about our connection," Tom continued. "She threatened to expose my brother's other crimes if I didn't help her. But I couldn't. Not after seeing what real love looks like between you and Antoinette." Charles sat heavily in a nearby chair, processing these layers of betrayal and redemption. All this time. "I'm resigning," Tom said firmly. "After I help you take them down. It's the least I can do." Before Charles could respond, Dr. Richardson appeared in the doorway, her face grave. "Mr. Woodward, there's been a development with Antoinette." As Charles rushed to follow her, his mind raced with the implications of these revelations. The woman he loved had been a pawn in a cruel game, yet she had transformed it into something real and precious. Her strength, her love, her music, none of that had been part of their scheme. Now he had to pray she would survive to see justice done. The next 48 hours brought Charles Woodward to his knees. As Sarah Mitchell's final act of vengeance, she triggered a clause in the company bylaws that froze all his remaining assets. Standing in the hospital's financial office, he stared at his declined credit card in disbelief. "I'm sorry, Mr. Woodward," the hospital administrator said gently. "Without payment or insurance coverage, we'll need to transfer the babies to a public facility." The NICU costs alone were astronomical, not to mention Antoinette's intensive care. His personal accounts were drained, his properties tied up in legal battles, and his remaining shares rendered untouchable. Dr. Richardson intervened, buying them 72 hours. "These babies aren't ready for transfer," she argued fiercely. "It could kill them." In Antoinette's room, the machines kept their relentless vigil. Her condition had stabilized but remained critical. The doctors spoke in careful terms about brain function, organ failure risks, long-term care needs. But Sophie, the smallest triplet, developed a lung infection. Alexander's feeding tube became displaced, requiring minor surgery. Grace, always the fighter, struggled with jaundice. Each complication added to the mounting medical bills. Elizabeth arrived to find Charles slumped in a chair between the NICU and Antoinette's room, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The mansion's being seized, she reported softly. The lawyers say Sarah's legal maneuvers could take months to untangle. Charles nodded numbly. The great Woodward fortune, built over generations, had crumbled in days. But it wasn't the money that broke him, it was the helplessness. I promised them, he whispered. I promised Antoinette I'd keep them safe. The hospital staff, who had grown to love the family, did what they could. Nurses worked extra shifts without charging. Kitchen workers brought food from home. But the reality of modern healthcare meant these gestures could only go so far. Late that night, a new crisis struck. Antoinette's fever spiked dangerously high. As doctors rushed to stabilize her, alarms blared in the NICU. Sophie's oxygen levels were dropping critically. Charles stood in the hallway between the two rooms, his world imploding. To the left, the woman he loved fought for her life. To the right, his tiny daughter struggled to breathe. For the first time since he was a child, he began to pray. The media circled like vultures. Woodward Empire collapses, the headline screamed. From billionaire to bankrupt, reporters camped outside the hospital, their cameras capturing his every haggard entrance and exit. Dr. Richardson found him in the chapel again, his fingers ghosting over the piano keys, playing the lullaby Antoinette had taught him. The next 24 hours are critical, she said quietly, for all of them. Charles looked up, his face aged years in days. I've lost everything, he said. The company, the money, the Woodward legacy, none of that matters. But them, I can't lose them. The lowest point came at dawn. Sophie's condition worsened, requiring immediate surgery they couldn't afford. Antoinette developed complications that demanded specialized treatment. The hospital board called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. Standing at the window of the NICU, watching his tiny children fight for life, Charles Woodward, who had once commanded billions, couldn't even afford the medicine they needed. In Antoinette's room, holding her lifeless hand, he finally broke down completely. I'm sorry, he sobbed. I built my life on controlling everything, on never needing anyone. Now, when you and our children need me most, I'm powerless. What good is a father who can't protect his family? What good is a man who can't save the woman he loves? The machines beeped their steady rhythm, offering no answers. Outside, the city that had once bowed to his financial power continued its relentless pace, indifferent to his fall. But even at rock bottom, in the darkest hour before dawn, something stirred in the heart of the broken billionaire, a fierce, primal determination that transcended money and power. The revelation began with a simple photograph found in Tom's old adoption records. The yellowed image showed a young French couple standing before a Paris conservatory, his birth parents. The woman's eyes were hauntingly familiar. She's Antoinette's Aunt, Tom explained to Charles in the hospital corridor. My mother was her father's sister. When they died in a car accident, the children were separated. Antoinette went to live with her mother's family in Provence. I was sent to America for adoption. The connection explained Tom's inexplicable draw to Antoinette from the beginning, but it was only the first thread in a tapestry of hidden truths about to unravel. Marcus Chen burst into the hallway, clutching his tablet. Sir, you need to see this. We found something in Sarah's old emails. The emails revealed a connection between Sarah Mitchell and James Cooper dating back 15 years. They had met at a music investment conference in Vienna, where they began their partnership targeting wealthy artists and musicians. But here's the crucial part. Marcus pointed to a specific exchange. They didn't choose Antoinette randomly. Sarah knew about her connection to the Woodward family through Tom. She orchestrated everything. The scheme had been elaborate. Sarah had used her position as Charles's wife to access old family records, discovering a generations-old connection between the Woodwards and Antoinette's maternal family in France. A debt of honor never repaid from World War II. Your grandfather, Tom explained, saved Antoinette's grandfather during the liberation of Paris. They made a pact the Woodwards would always watch over their family. Charles felt the weight of this forgotten promise. My father never mentioned this. Because Sarah's father interfered, Marcus continued, pulling up more documents. He buried the connection when he arranged your marriage to Sarah. They've been manipulating both families for decades. But the deepest betrayal was yet to be revealed. Elizabeth arrived with a stack of papers from the family lawyer's office. "Look at this," she said, spreading out the documents. "Sarah's father didn't just arrange your marriage. He orchestrated your first wife's departure too. Everything, every heartbreak, every loss of trust was engineered to make you the perfect target." The truth hit Charles like a physical blow. His entire adult life had been manipulated, shaped by unseen hands to create the precise circumstance for this final betrayal. Yet amidst these dark revelations came a spark of hope. Tom had discovered something in the old family trust documents, a clause that could break Sarah's legal hold on the Woodward assets. "Your grandfather wasn't just making a promise," Tom explained. "He legally bound the family fortune to honor the debt to Antoinette's family, if we can prove her identity." Charles stared through the NICU window at his children. These babies, they're the living fulfillment of that promise. The family's united, just as they should have been generations ago. The pieces began falling into place with dizzying speed. The French consulate confirmed Antoinette's lineage through old resistance records. Tom's adoption files provided the final proof of the family connection. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. James Cooper, torn by his brother Tom's revelation, had kept records of every scheme, every manipulation, every crime. "It was insurance," he explained from jail. "Sarah's father. He's the mastermind behind everything. I can prove it." As the truth emerged, the implications rippled through New York society. The Mitchell family's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Years of financial manipulation, social engineering, and calculated cruelty came to light. In Antoinette's hospital room, Charles held her hand, sharing the discoveries even though she couldn't respond. "You were never alone," he whispered. "All these years, all these struggles, you were always meant to be part of our family. We just didn't know it." The machines beeped steadily, but for the first time in days, Charles felt hope stirring. The truth hidden for so long might finally set them all free. Justice arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning when FBI agents strode into Mitchell Financial's gleaming offices. Sarah Mitchell was in the middle of a board meeting when they entered, her perfectly composed facade cracking as the lead agent read her rights. "Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and financial crimes against multiple institutions and individuals." Simultaneously across town, similar scenes played out. James Cooper was transferred to federal custody, his detailed confessions forming the backbone of a massive RICO case. Sarah's father, the respected William Mitchell, was escorted from his country club in handcuffs. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of documented fraud, carefully archived by Cooper as insurance, laid bare the entire conspiracy. The Mitchells' empire had been built on a foundation of stolen dreams and broken lives. In Mount Sinai Hospital, Charles watched the news coverage with a mixture of relief and weariness. Justice felt hollow with Antoinette still unconscious and his children fighting for their lives. But the arrests triggered an immediate legal cascade. The emergency court order froze all Mitchell assets, not Woodward ones. Within hours, the family lawyers had untangled the legal knots Sarah had tied. "The accounts are unlocked," Elizabeth announced, rushing into the hospital. "All of it, the company shares, the properties, everything. It's back under your control." The hospital administrator arrived moments later. "Mr. Woodward, I'm happy to inform you that all medical care can continue uninterrupted." Yet the greatest victory came from an unexpected quarter. The other victims of Sarah and Cooper's schemes, emboldened by the arrests, came forward. Musicians, artists, and performers from across Europe and America shared similar stories of betrayal and loss. "We're not just pursuing criminal charges," the district attorney announced at a press conference. "We're establishing a restitution fund for all victims, starting with the recovery of the Mitchells' hidden assets." The French government moved swiftly to restore Antoinette's citizenship and artistic credentials. The Paris Conservatory issued a formal apology, offering her an honorary position once she recovered. Inside Wood capital, a revolution took place. The board members who had accepted Mitchell bribes resigned in disgrace. Sarah's appointees were removed. By evening, Charles's loyal executives had restored control of the company. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Richard Woodward, Charles's uncle, stood before the family board. "We were wrong," he announced, his voice heavy with emotion. "Charles didn't just protect our fortune, he honored our deepest obligation. The debt to Antoinette's family has been paid not just in money, but in love." The elderly man turned to Charles, who had joined the meeting via video from the hospital. "Your grandfather would be proud. You've restored more than our wealth, you've restored our family's honor." As news of the arrest spread, more secrets emerged. Sarah's first victim had been her own stepsister, whose promising musical career she had systematically destroyed out of jealousy. The woman, now living in obscurity in Boston, provided crucial testimony. But for Charles, true justice wasn't measured in arrests or restored fortunes. It came in smaller moments, being able to approve every medical treatment his children needed, watching the stress ease from Dr. Richardson's face as resources flowed freely again, knowing Antoinette would wait to find her name and reputation restored. Tom Francis, despite offering his resignation, found himself appointed to lead the victim restitution program. His unique perspective as both investigator and family member made him perfect for the role. "We can't undo the past," he told Charles, "but we can make sure this never happens to another artist, another dreamer." The final piece fell into place when Cooper, facing sentencing, made a full confession. He detailed how Sarah had first blackmailed him, then seduced him into becoming her partner. His testimony ensured the Mitchells would never harm another family. Standing in the NICU, watching his children grow stronger each day, Charles reflected on the true meaning of justice. It wasn't just about punishment or restoration, it was about creating a world where love could flourish without fear. Dawn broke over Manhattan as Dr. Richardson stood in Antoinette's room, studying the latest test results with growing amazement. After weeks of despair, something had changed. "Her numbers are improving," she announced to Charles, "all of them. It's like her body suddenly remembered how to fight." In the NICU, the triplets showed similar inexplicable progress. Sophie's lung infection began clearing. Alexander's feeding improved dramatically. Grace, always the strongest, now breathed entirely on her own. The medical staff could barely contain their excitement. In 20 years of neonatal care, the head nurse confided, "I've never seen such a synchronized recovery." Charles divided his time between rooms, playing music in both. He'd set up a small keyboard in the NICU and would practice the pieces Antoinette had taught him. The babies responded noticeably to their father's somewhat clumsy renditions of Chopin. "They know it's you," Dr. Richardson observed. "Their vital signs stabilize when you play." The breakthrough came during one such music session. Charles was attempting Debussy's Clair de Lune when he heard a weak voice behind him. "Your timing is off." He turned so quickly he nearly knocked over the keyboard. Antoinette lay there, eyes open, a faint smile on her pale face. "The babies," she whispered. "Our babies." "They're fighting," Charles said, gripping her hand, "just like their mother." News of Antoinette's awakening spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff members who had invested their hearts in the family's struggles stopped by to welcome her back. The triplets seemed to sense their mother's recovery. Their vital signs grew stronger by the hour. Dr. Richardson authorized moving them into Antoinette's room for brief periods, allowing the family to be together for the first time since their birth. Skin-to-skin contact is crucial for premature babies, she explained, helping arrange the tiny infants on Antoinette's chest. But this is something more. Watching Antoinette hold their children, Charles understood what the doctor meant. There was a tangible energy in the room, a connection that transcended medical explanation. The recovery accelerated from there. Antoinette regained strength daily. The triplets met milestone after milestone, defying the usual timeline for premature development. Musicians continued to perform in the hospital, but now Antoinette could listen consciously. Her room became a sanctuary of healing music, with different artists playing gentle classical pieces throughout the day. One morning, she asked for the keyboard. The staff hesitated, concerned about her strength, but Dr. Richardson approved. Music isn't just entertainment for her, the doctor said. It's medicine. Propped up in bed, Antoinette played a simple lullaby. The babies, in their nearby bassinets, responded immediately. Their monitors showed perfect synchronization with the rhythm mother's music. Charles stood in the doorway, witnessing the moment with tears in his eyes. This was healing in its purest form, love expressed through music, binding the family together. The day the triplets were deemed strong enough to leave the NICU permanently marked a celebration throughout Mount Sinai. Staff members lined the corridors, applauding as each tiny baby was wheeled to their mother's room. "You've given us all something precious," Dr. Richardson told them. "You've reminded us why we became healers in the first place." Finally, 6 weeks after the crisis began, Dr. Richardson delivered the news they'd been praying for. "You're all going home," she announced. "All 5 of you together." The hospital staff organized a farewell concert in the garden. As Antoinette sat in a wheelchair, holding Grace while Charles cradled Alexander and Sophie, the combined sounds of a string quartet filled the air. "It's not just their recovery that's remarkable," Dr. Richardson confided to her colleagues. "It's what they've taught us about healing, that love, music and family can accomplish what medicine alone cannot." The Woodward mansion had transformed during their absence. Gone were the austere furnishings and cold formality. In their place, warmth and life filled every room. The grand ballroom had become a nursery, its high ceilings now adorned with delicate mobiles that caught the morning light. 3 antique cribs, restored from the Woodward family collection, stood where corporate functions had once been held. The walls, once lined with stern portraits of past patriarchs, now displayed colorful paintings of musical notes and French landscapes. Charles carried Antoinette over the threshold himself, despite her protests that she could walk. Behind them, Stephanie supervised the careful transport of the triplets, each tiny bundle precious beyond measure. "Welcome home," Charles whispered, not just to Antoinette but to all of them. The words held special weight. This wasn't just his house anymore, it was their family home. The staff had outdone themselves in preparation. Fresh flowers filled every room, their scent mixing with the aroma of French bread baking in the kitchen. Antoinette's piano gleamed in the morning light, recently tuned and waiting. Most touching were the personal touches, photographs of the family's journey displayed alongside the baby's hospital bracelets, sheet music framed like precious art, and a wall of cards and letters from well-wishers around the world. Elizabeth had overseen the transformation of Charles's study into a comfortable family room. "You won't be needing a separate retreat anymore," she teased her brother. The biggest surprise waited in what had once been the formal dining room. Now it housed a small recording studio, complete with professional equipment and perfect acoustics. "For when you're ready to play again," Charles explained to Antoinette, who touched the piano keys with trembling fingers, "your music deserves to be shared with the world." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the mansion's garden. It was an intimate affair, attended only by close family, loyal staff, and the medical team that had become part of their extended family. Dr. Richardson held Grace during the ceremony, while Stephanie cradled Alexander and Elizabeth gently rocked Sophie. The babies, dressed in christening gowns made from Antoinette's mother's wedding dress, slept peacefully through their parents' vows. Charles had insisted on learning to play for the occasion. As Antoinette walked down the aisle, his somewhat imperfect rendition of Pachelbel's canon filled the air, played with more love than technical skill. I take you his voice shook slightly as he recited his vows, not because of any contract or obligation, but because you taught me that true wealth lies in love, family, and music? Antoinette's response came both in words and music. After the ceremony, she played for the first time since leaving the hospital a piece she had composed during their journey, telling their story through notes and harmonies. The reception was unlike any previous Woodward gathering. Members of the homeless community sat alongside business executives. Musicians who had played at the hospital performed with students from Juilliard. The barriers between social classes dissolved in the joy of celebration. Uncle Richard, watching Charles dance with Antoinette while balancing Sophie in one arm, leaned over to Elizabeth. "I've never seen him so happy," he observed. "Or so human." As evening fell, the couple shared a quiet moment in the nursery, watching their sleeping children. "I never thanked you properly," Charles said softly. "For what?" "For showing me what really matters. For bringing music back into my life. For making me a father in more than just name." Antoinette smiled, leaning against him. "And I never thanked you for proving that sometimes fairy tales do come true, just not in the way we expect." The next morning, they registered the children's official names: Grace Melody, Alexander Symphony, and Sophie Harmony Woodward. Names that honored both their mother's artistry and their father's newfound appreciation for life's beautiful music. The transformation of Woodward Capital began with a simple idea during a late-night feeding session. As Charles cradled Alexander while Antoinette nursed the girls, they discussed how to use their restored fortune to make a real difference. "Not just charity," Antoinette said softly. "Something that changes lives the way music changed mine." The Woodward Foundation for Arts and Healing launched 6 months later. Its first project was the renovation of St. Patrick's Cathedral's basement into a state-of-the-art music school for underprivileged children. Father Michael blessed the space, tears in his eyes as he watched former members of his homeless congregation receive their first music lessons. Charles surprised everyone by taking piano lessons alongside the students. "If I'm going to be on the board," he explained, "I should understand what our students experience." The foundation's reach expanded rapidly. They established scholarships for talented musicians facing hardship, created a program to provide instruments to schools in low-income areas, and funded music therapy programs in hospitals across the city. Antoinette took a personal interest in each project. She could often be found teaching at the music school, her 3 babies contentedly playing in a corner while she introduced young minds to the magic of music. The mansion itself underwent another transformation. The East Wing became a community music center, where students could practice and perform. The ballroom hosted regular concerts where established musicians performed alongside students. "This is what wealth is," for Charles would say at board meetings. "Not to build walls, but to open doors." Their most ambitious project was the Harmony House Network, a series of shelters specifically designed for artists and musicians facing hardship. Each facility included practice rooms, recording spaces, and performance venues. "We're not just providing beds," Antoinette explained to potential donors. "We're preserving dreams." The triplets grew into this environment of music and compassion. Grace showed early signs of her mother's talent, while Alexander preferred to experiment with different instruments. Sophie, surprisingly, exhibited her father's head for business, combined with her mother's artistic sensitivity. Charles adapted his business practices to support their vision. Woodward Capital began specializing in arts investment, helping talented performers protect themselves from exploitation. Tom Francis headed a special legal division providing pro bono services to artists. The annual Woodward Foundation Gala became New York's most unique social event. Unlike traditional charity balls, it featured performances by students alongside world-renowned musicians. Wealthy donors sat beside homeless artists, all united by music. Their work caught international attention. The French government invited them to establish a sister program in Paris. Other cities reached out, hoping to replicate their success. But perhaps their most meaningful achievement was the creation of the hospital music program. Remembering their own experience at Mount Sinai, they established a network of musicians who performed in hospitals, particularly in children's wards and NICUs. Dr. Richardson helped design the program protocols. "We're seeing remarkable results," she reported. "The healing power of music combined with compassion is truly transformative." The Woodward Mansion's gates, once firmly closed to the world, now stood open. The gardens hosted community concerts where anyone could attend. The kitchen, under Stephanie's supervision, provided meals for music school students and shelter residents. "We're not just teaching music," Antoinette would say. "We're teaching hope." Charles, watching his wife conduct a children's choir while their own children played among the students, finally understood what his mother had tried to tell him long ago: music isn't just something we hear, it's something we live. The Foundation's motto, inscribed in both English and French above every facility they opened, summed up their mission: "Through music, we rise together." 1 year later, the Woodward Mansion buzzed with excitement as guests arrived for the triplets' first birthday celebration. The guest list reflected their transformed World Hospital staff who had saved their lives, musicians who had played during the darkest hours, members of the homeless community who had kept vigil, and the extended family that had grown far beyond blood relations. The Grand Hall, decorated with musical notes and French flowers, hosted an unlikely mix of society figures and street musicians. Dr. Richardson arrived early, carrying 3 hand-knitted blankets. Father Michael blessed the celebration, his shelter residents now dressed in new clothes provided by the Foundation's Dignity program. The triplets had grown into distinct personalities. Grace, the smallest at birth, now displayed her mother's quiet grace and love for melody. Alexander, steady and observant, showed his father's determination. Sophie, the fighter, combined both parents' strengths, already trying to conduct along when music played. Charles stood at the piano, nervously adjusting his tie. After a year of lessons, he was finally ready to perform in public. As the room quieted, he began playing Clair de Lune, the piece Antoinette had first taught him. His technique wasn't perfect, but the love in every note brought tears to eyes across the room. Antoinette joined him for a duet, their fingers dancing across the keys together as their children watched in wonder. The moment captured everything they had built: partnership, music, family, and hope. Uncle Richard raised his glass in a toast. "A year ago, we thought the Woodward legacy was about money and power. Today, we understand it's about something far more precious: the harmony of love and purpose." The Foundation's first-year report, released that day, told a compelling story: 50 young musicians sponsored, 3 harmony houses opened, thousands of hospital performances given, and countless lives touched. But the real success stories weren't in the numbers. There was Maria, a talented violinist they'd found playing in the subway, now studying at Juilliard. James, a former banker who lost everything, discovered his gift for teaching music to children. Sarah, a teenage runaway, found her voice in the Foundation's choir and reconciled with her family. The triplets' birthday cake featured 3 tiny pianos, but the real gift was the announcement of the Woodward Triple Bridge program: 3 new initiatives linking music education, healthcare, and housing support for artists in crisis. As evening fell, the celebration moved to the garden. String lights twinkled above as musicians from every walk of life shared their art. A classical quartet followed a jazz ensemble, then joined forces with a hip-hop artist from the shelter program, creating something entirely new. Charles held Antoinette close as they watched their children being passed among their extended family, Dr. Richardson sharing a medical joke with Elizabeth, Tom discussing legal protections with Father Michael, Stephanie orchestrating everything with her usual grace. "Did you ever imagine this?" Antoinette asked softly, "when you first stopped your car that night?" Charles smiled, watching Grace attempt to conduct the orchestra with a tiny spoon. "I thought I was writing a contract. Instead, I was starting a symphony." A young girl from the music school approached shyly, holding sheet music. "Mrs. Woodward, I wrote this for the babies." Her composition, though simple, captured the journey of the past year from darkness to light, from solitude to community. As the evening wound down, Charles gathered everyone for a final announcement. The Woodward Foundation would be expanding internationally, starting with a special focus on war-torn regions where artists and musicians had lost everything. "Because everyone deserves a chance to have their music heard," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everyone deserves to find their harmony." The triplets, fighting sleep, curled up on blankets near the piano as the last notes of the evening filled the air. Around them, their extraordinary extended family, from corporate executives to former homeless musicians, celebrated not just 3 tiny lives, but the rebirth of hope itself. This was their true legacy, not the money restored or the reputation redeemed, but the lives transformed through love, music, and second chances. The Woodward name would no longer just represent wealth and power, but the endless possibilities when hearts open to life's unexpected melodies. Dear friends, we hope this story touched your heart and reminded you of the transformative power of love and music. If it moved you, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Charles and Antoinette's journey resonated with you most? Support our team by subscribing to our channel, where we bring you more meaningful stories that celebrate the human spirit. Share this video with your loved ones who might need a reminder that second chances and true love exist. Don't forget to like this video. It helps us reach more people with stories that matter. Every like, comment, and share helps build our community of storytellers and dreamers. Thank you for being part of our journey. Stay tuned for more heartwarming tales. See you in our next video.